My hypothesis here is that nearly all of the supposed existing catastrophes and the ones that are predicted for the future are either the result of being invisible or remote or both. In other words, unable to be verified by the average human being, who then depends upon activists, the media, and politicians to tell them what to think about it. Before I get into that, though, let me tell you a little bit about myself. Here's where I'm from. I was born on this floating village in 1947 on the far windswept northwest coast of Vancouver Island in a little logging camp that my dad owned. There was no road to Winter Harbor. It didn't actually come till 1965. When I was a teenager, I thought, wow, now this place is going to grow. Half the people used the road to get out. Anyways, there's what it looks like today. Just a sleepy little fishing village with lots of salmon on the other side of those hills. And the view from our cabin there, which we go to all the time because it's such a beautiful, peaceful place full of wildlife and mostly nature and not that many people. At 14, I was shipped off to boarding school in Vancouver, where I soon learned city ways, studying life science in my high school years, and eventually going to the University of British Columbia, where I continued with that: biology, biochemistry, genetics, a little forestry, which is the main industry in my province. And in the mid-1960s, before the word was known to the general public, I discovered the science of ecology, the science of how all living things are interrelated and how we are related to them. It was the height of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the threat of all-out nuclear war, and the emerging consciousness of the environment. I was transformed into a radical environmental activist. Can't seem to get it to go that way anymore. I found myself in a church basement with a like-minded group of what appeared to be hippies. Actually, all of us were professionals of one sort or another, planning a protest voyage against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. We proved that a somewhat ragtag-looking bunch could sail a boat across the North Pacific, provide a focal point for media attention to the nuclear tests, and help change the course of history. When that H-bomb was detonated in November '71, it turned out to be the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever set off. President Nixon canceled the remaining tests in a month or so after we did this. Flushed with victory, on our way back from Alaska, we were welcomed into the big house at the Namgis Nation at Alert Bay, where we were made brothers of the tribe. That's me in the middle with hat in hand. And for us, this began the tradition of the Warriors of the Rainbow, which we'd never heard about before. But it's a Cree legend that says one day when the skies are black and the birds fall dead and the waters are poisoned, that people around the world will join together to save the earth. We named our ship the Rainbow Warrior, and I spent the next 15 years on the front lines of the movement around the world. Next, we took on French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific. France was still detonating atomic and hydrogen bombs in the air in the early 70s, sending radiation around the southern hemisphere. They were a little more difficult. It took a couple of years to drive these nuclear tests underground, but we eventually succeeded in doing that. As late as 1985, French commandos, under direct orders from President Mitterrand, bombed and sank the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbor, killing our photographer. But the campaign continued till long after I left. It wasn't until the mid-90s that nuclear testing finally ended there and in almost everywhere else in the world at around the same time. Going back 10 years to 1975, I'm driving a small rubber boat into the first encounter with the Soviet factory whaling fleet in the North Pacific to save the whales, which were then being slaughtered at the rate of 30,000 per year by the Japanese and Soviet fleets. We confronted the whalers. There's the killer boat bringing whales in to go up that hole in the back of the factory ship there to be cut up on deck. We put ourselves in front of their harpoons in our little rubber boats to protect the fleeing whales. This got us on national TV around the world, bringing the Save the Whales movement into everyone's living room for the first time. Just 4 years later, after 4 voyages into the Pacific every summer, factory whaling was banned in all the world's oceans. Here I'm sitting on a baby seal off the east coast of Canada to protect it from the hunter's club. The seal was clubbed and skinned. I was arrested and hauled off to jail in a helicopter, but this picture appeared in over 3,000 newspapers around the world the next morning. This and many other direct actions brought changes to the way Canada manages its East Coast seal herds. So to make a long story short, why did I leave Greenpeace after 15 years of doing things that we felt were the right things to be doing at the time? Along the way, we were called Greenpeace, of course. The peace was about stopping nuclear war and about a peaceful human civilization. The green was about nature. Along the way, the peace kind of got dropped off, and all that was left was the green. And now my fellow Greenpeacers and the rest of the movement were characterizing the human species as the enemy of nature, the enemies of the earth. I never did buy into that. It's too much like original sin for me. Like as if we're the only evil species and all the other species are good, even the rats and diseases. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense to me. So I was feeling like I should get out of there for a few years. And the whole idea that humans are the bad guys in the whole story of evolution and creation just struck me as being completely ridiculous. Because obviously only a small part of the human people are bad. Unfortunately, it only takes a few percent of bad people to equal the goodness of the good people, it seems, because they're willing to do things that we wouldn't do. But there you have it. But it's still not all evil people on this planet. And some people got it right. At least she's not blaming someone else. But the straw that broke the camel's back was when my fellow directors, none of whom had any formal science education, decided we should ban chlorine worldwide. Now it's true that DDT and dioxins and, just trying to remember the other terrible thing that is a chlorinated hydrocarbons are a class of chemicals. And many of them can be quite toxic. They're exaggerated in many cases. But the fact of the matter is, chlorine is the most important element for public health and medicine. When I was a kid, iodine was the most important thing in the medicine chest. Because if you got a cut and you didn't want to get it infected, you put iodine on it. The same thing is true with chlorine added to drinking water. It's the biggest advance in the history of public health, as well as our pools and spas and all the rest. It stops waterborne communicable diseases. And about 75% of our synthetic pharmaceuticals, medicines, are made with chlorine chemistry. The reason chlorine is the most important element for public health and medicine is precisely because it's toxic to bacteria, which are trying to kill us. So there's this naive fantasy that we're going to have a world without toxic, that anything that's toxic should be banned. Don't think that would be such a good idea. So something so specific that they finally did adopt in an international meeting about 3 months before I formally left just was the end of it for me. And it's been the same ever since. I don't think they've adopted a position since I left that I agree with. Now, what is the fundamental principle of science? It is observation. Observation of things that happen that you can either see or hear or detect with an instrument so that you know what took place. And science is about studying and observing things that are taking place and trying to figure out why they happened. Cause and effect. It's really all about that. And then replication or reproducibility is used to make sure that every time you do the same thing, you get the same result. And there you've got science. There's methodology, that's a much more complicated aspect in order to make sure that you're only looking at the variables that you're studying. But by and large, observation is the key. I believe, as I mentioned a little bit in the introduction, that the reason that so many of the invisible catastrophes and threats of doom work with the media and the public is because they are actually not capable of going and observing what they're being told is happening. Carbon dioxide is obviously invisible, except Greta Thunberg can apparently see it. And that's what she's doing there, is she's saying, oh, I can see what it's doing, right? Which is a lie, but she's saying that, and the reason she's saying that is to verify to other people who might believe her that she knows what's really happening. Just like the people in the movement and in the politics and the scientists with the government grants are all telling us they can see what's happening. They can't see what's happening. And so they can make up any story they want. And of course, correlation is not necessarily causation, but causation requires correlation. Look at this 570 million year history of, in the blue, temperature, and in the purple, CO2. Look at the middle of the graph there, where first one goes up and the other goes down, and then the other goes up and the other goes down. Exact opposite of correlation. This is perfect negative correlation, which proves there's no causation if it happens all the time. But it's happening most of the time in terms of the long-term CO2 and temperature trends. And many of us have known this for a long time, and yet it still doesn't have any impact on the extremism of the reporting and adoption of policies like climate emergency. Just doesn't have any effect. My favorite is this perfect correlation between ice cream sales and shark attacks. And this highlights a very common phenomenon in correlation, and is why correlation does not imply causation, is that very often a third variable underlies these two, and that's warm weather in the summer when people eat ice cream and then go swimming and get attacked by a shark. It's just the way it works. Okay, number one invisible catastrophe is that polar bears will become extinct due to warming and ice loss. Well, actually, polar bears aren't invisible, are they? But how many people can go to the Arctic and go the whole way around the Arctic Circle and count how many polar bears there are? I don't even believe anybody has done that, but there's probably some sampling procedure where they fly around and see how many there are in a certain area and make an extrapolation from that. Nobody can verify this for themselves, though. And this is what you get from National Geographic. This is what climate change looks like. A direct quote from the magazine. It has absolutely nothing to do with climate change. It has to do with an old, starving polar bear. And of course, all polar bears die in the end. Is there somebody who doesn't think that, doesn't know that? And they don't have old folks' homes to go to, where their kids can pay the rent. Well, usually they can pay the rent. Maybe their kids don't have anything left over after that. But imagine that, using an image like this, a sad image like this, to say it's climate change. And the same with the NGOs. This is the face of climate change, from Sea Legacy. And they make money on dying old polar bears with no teeth left. That's what they're doing. It wasn't until 1973 that a historic event occurred. Up till then, polar bear hunting was unrestricted around the entire Arctic Circle. The population had been reduced to between 6,000 to 8,000. Nobody ever talks about the treaty that was signed among all the Arctic nations to limit or ban polar bear hunting. Canada allows 2% of the adult polar bears to be harvested with an Inuit guide for a rich hunter. And the Inuit guide ends up with like $10,000 US or something, which is a good thing. But the population now is estimated at between 22 and 31,000. And Susan Crockford said it could be up to 40,000. It has increased by a tremendous amount. because of the end of unrestricted hunting. That's all it took. Because a lot of polar bears, you can imagine how many guys want to have a polar bear rug or a polar bear hanging on the wall. We know for certain, for example, that polar bears survived through the Eemian, the glacial period before the last one, so 120,000 years ago. Polar bears didn't evolve until 400,000 years ago. They're a brand new species. The only reason they exist is because it makes sense not to be brown in the Arctic. So brown bears, the grizzly bear, the European brown bear, which came in only 15,000 years ago to the New World, along with the people, turned into a polar bear. They can still breed with each other successfully. The polar bear is in fact not a distinct species. It is a variety of the European brown bear. So there you go. And this is from this year, a picture of the northern hemisphere. And they say the ice is disappearing. This is from April. Well, it's still pretty cold up there in April. And so they say if the ice disappears, which it refuses to do, that there will be less polar bears if the ice shrinks, because there won't be as much ice to hunt seals on. How do they expect to get any seals if there's no ocean which can grow plankton in the Arctic? If the whole Arctic Ocean is covered with ice. No plankton grows under ice. It needs sunlight. So when the sea actually gets exposed in the Arctic, then the plankton can grow and feed the fish and feed the seals and feed the bears. So the idea that less ice equals less bears is complete BS. In the Eemian, there was probably way less ice than there is now, and polar bears survived through that. Of course, there wasn't unrestricted hunting either. But they did survive through that, and they will survive through what's ever happening now. This just shows Arctic sea ice extent going back to 1900. The first 13 years are reconstructed, but from then on we actually have records. And it was in 1943, actually, at that low point there, when the Canadian boat St. Roch went back and forth through the Northwest Passage one year and then the next, coming back. It was wide open for a boat with only like 100 horsepower. Actually, Amundsen got through there in 1908 with 6 horsepower. And these days, it's quite often still blocked so that boats can't get through, even in the summer. So it hasn't changed that much. And down below you can see from, I think that's from 1980s to the present, that's not much of a trend going on in the Arctic these days. So they haven't talked a lot about the polar bears going extinct lately. Have you noticed that? It's been a little quiet?
Yeah.
That might be because the people who actually live in the Arctic, the Inuit people, did a big study around the whole pole and put it out tabled it in the Nunavut government in northern Canada, saying there's too darn many polar bears now. They're eating our people. They're coming into our kitchens through the window. And you saw how big that polar bear was there that hunter killed. This isn't like a black bear coming in your house. This is like a dinosaur, a Tyrannosaurus Rex coming in your house. And that's what they're saying. Too many polar bears, because they've been unrestricted in their growth. It used to be that the Inuit controlled a number of polar bears to some extent. The only reason the Inuit could ever live there in the first place because they had a pack of dogs that could get the polar bears to go away. Otherwise they would have eaten them all. But now they're starting to eat them again. That's not good. Not good for Inuit. Okay, I won't spend as much time on climate change as I normally do, but this is of course number 2, invisible catastrophe, and we can't see CO2, so we can't see what it's doing, and we don't even really know exactly what percentage of the greenhouse effect CO2 is, but it's less than 5% if you use arithmetic properly. You look on the internet and all the warmists say it's only 60% of the water is only 60%. Well, what else is there? Mostly only CO2. It's 40% of the greenhouse effect? No. Water is 25 to 125 times more prevalent in the atmosphere than CO2, and it has a wider bandwidth of absorption, and that's just humidity. So H2O is definitely 95% or more of the greenhouse effect, leaving CO2 possibly negligible, undetectable, insignificant, etc. That is almost certainly the case. We are at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period, which began with the Eocene thermal maximum 15 million years after the dinosaur extinction. We don't know why this happened. It might be continental drift changing the ocean currents. It's not anything that's obvious, but it's such a long-term thing that continental drift kind of is in the right time scale to be affecting this sort of thing. But look where we are now. The coldest it's been in 50 million years. It's actually the coldest it's been in 250 million years now, even in this interglacial period. Here's the last 5 million years, 5.5. 2.5 million years ago, or 2.6, is where they say the onset of the Pleistocene occurred. And there you have, for the first 1.5 million years, the 41,000 year cycle based on the tilt of the Earth changing, and the 100,000 year cycle based on the orbit of the Earth changing. The Pleistocene conundrum is, why did it change from the 41,000 year cycle to the 100,000 year cycle? That answer is not known. Coming a little closer to the present, this is the Holocene. We have been in a cooling trend for 5,000 years already. We are ending the Holocene. They're normally about 10,000 years long. This one is now well into the 10,000 year period. So what we see there is probably the beginning of the long descent into the next major glaciation 80,000 years from now. I mean, that's what it looks like. And it's been so regular for 1 million years, 10 times for 1 million years, that there you have it. And here is a wonderful chart. Most people don't know that the last 5,000 years has actually been named the Neoglacial, the New Glacial. Just because glaciers are retreating now for the last 300 years and in this modern warm period. But if you look, you will see that the Little Ice Age, which is the tallest bars there, is the most glacial advance that has occurred since the beginning of the Holocene. This was also the coldest it's been since the beginning of the Holocene. None of this is reported. These are all true things. I'm just trying to show you the most important ones, especially Willie Soon and the Connollys, who produced these two charts in a major paper full of statistics and weather station analysis around the world, showing very clearly that temperature is far more highly correlated with total solar irradiation and the variations in it than it is with CO2. That's why they don't like Willie in the New York Times. Nothing to do with who he gets funded by. This just shows for a number of parameters that extreme weather events are not increasing. As a matter of fact, in some cases decreasing. It's actually predictable that hurricane strength will decrease as the Earth warms, and the difference between the polar and temperate temperatures becomes reduced, because it's the difference between cold and hot that makes these tornadoes and cyclones. So there you go. Even the IPCC, now this is interesting, because the IPCC agrees with this. They say there's no trends, but that doesn't affect the activists and the media, or even many of the scientists like Michael Mann. They just play the weather, extreme weather thing. First they said it was global warming, then they changed to climate change, and when you said that was a pretty cold winter last year, they said, oh no, that's just the weather. You mustn't confuse the weather with climate change. Now what do they talk about? All they talk about is weather. They just moved the goalposts every time their prediction didn't come up. And this is an example of the y-axis effect. Very often the y-axis in temperature graphs is like only 2 degrees Celsius. So it makes a tenth of a degree look like a big thing. This is using sort of a normal range of global temperatures and showing 144 years of global temperature. It's not like as if there's a catastrophe going on there in terms of warming. It has warmed, and if you look at the bottom red line, you can actually see that it rises above the hashtag mark across there, but not very much. This is a much more, in tune depiction of what's actually happened in the last 140 years. Post-glacial sea level rise, of course, the sea was 420 feet lower, 120 meters lower than it is today at the height of the last glaciation, 18 to 20,000 years ago. And then the melting began and continued very rapidly in terms of time scale up until 8,000 years ago. Now they show on this graph, and they always show that from 8,000 to the present, there's been a slight net rise. Many of us do not believe that. In fact, there may have been, because of the neoglacial cooling, an actual net reduction in sea level rise over the last 5,000 years. And this kind of demonstrates that. Thousands of islands at the equator in Indonesia and Palau and Vietnam, a little to the north, look like this. They are made of rock. That is erosion from a quiet tropical sea. As a matter of fact, it looks like maybe the tide's gone out a little bit since it started. So what's been happening is since 8,000 years ago, when all of the big mid-latitude, low-elevation glaciers finished melting, it's been going up and down, up and down, up and down with the Roman warm period, the Dark Ages, the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, the modern warm period. It's just been fluctuating a meter or two at the most. And these rocks have worn in 12 feet by water in that time. It takes thousands of years for that to happen. If the water had been continuously rising during this period, there's no possibility that that could have occurred, because the water would have kept going up instead of carving that rock out like that. Even NASA now recognizes the greening of the Earth. Down further in the text, they talk about how this might not be such a good thing. Oh yeah, right. Too many plants. Too many trees. And here's the CSIRO from Australia from 1984, showing in some cases a 30% increase in biomass. And note that it's in the driest areas that you have the biggest increase in biomass, because not only does CO2 fertilize plants and make them grow faster, but it makes them much more efficient with water. Because when the stomata have to open to let the CO2 in when it's thin, they have to have a lot of them, and that lets a lot of water out. When they don't need to have so many openings for the CO2 because it's more concentrated, they close their stomata or produce less of them. Automatically, they know how to do this. And then they spread out into areas where trees couldn't even grow before. Here you have Craig Idso showing how trees grow much faster at higher levels of CO2. On the very far right, you have a little more than doubling of CO2, and you've got way more than doubling of biomass of the tree. Already, trees in a research forest in Germany are growing 40% faster than they did in 1960, individual trees. The whole forest is actually growing by 15% more, because the trees, they just can't grow that much wood on an area. The individual trees are growing faster, so the smaller ones thin out quicker. But the whole forest is growing faster than it would have otherwise. And of course, the absolute proof of fertilization by CO2 is the fact that commercial greenhouse growers around the world purposefully buy and inject CO2 into their greenhouses to get 20 to 60% higher yield from their plants. And what else do you need to know? Well, what else you need to know is that CO2 hasn't been doing so well lately. there is the 570 million year, as best we know it, trend for CO2 in the global atmosphere, down. Now the first big down there was when forests evolved and lignin was invented and trees increased the global biomass by at least 10 times what it was before, because everything was flat on the ground before. Now there's these forests. The forests of the world contain at least 90% of its total biomass. So that's 90% of the carbon in life, because wood is 50% carbon. So that happened, and then it went up again. And there's different theories about why it did. Never mind why it did. It did. It got back up to about 2,500 ppm, about 160 million, 150 million years ago. But since then, it's gone steadily down. Now, we don't know all the numbers. We know a lot of them. But when something's going steadily down in the atmosphere, it means not as much of it is being put into the atmosphere as is coming out of the atmosphere. Right? Right. Nobody going to argue with that. Here's where the CO2 is. The carbon, sorry, not the CO2, but the carbon. I use carbon for both CO2 and carbon compounds when you're comparing where it is, because it's in different forms. It's in the form in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide. Note that even today at 400 ppm, there's only 850 billion tons of carbon as CO2 in the atmosphere, and there's 2,000 billion tons of carbon in plants and soils put together, the living component of the ecosystem on the ground. This does not count marine life. It's just the terrestrial biomass is 2.5 times as much carbon as the whole atmosphere. And it was down so much lower before we came along at 180 ppm 20,000 years ago that it was almost like gone from the atmosphere compared to what's in the rest of the ecosystem in the cycle. Note that there's 45 times as much CO2 in the oceans, as carbon as CO2 in the oceans, than there is in the air. So a very small change in oceanic CO2 results in a big change in atmospheric CO2. When the oceans cool, they take CO2 in. When the oceans warm, they let CO2 out. But the balance overall, look where the carbon is. Earth's crust. 100 million billion tons of carbon are in the form of limestone, marble, chalk, and dolomite, all of which is of life origin, as far as we know. That's where it came from. It came from the carbon dioxide in the water by these things. Calcifying marine organisms, which 500 million years ago learned to control the crystallization of calcium carbonate to build armor plating for themselves. Now, many species from many strands of evolution figured out how to do this all around the same time. So there's obviously a common factor way back in evolution somewhere. But they all figured it out during the Cambrian explosion. The coccolithophores on the left are plants, the basis of the marine food chain. They learned to build these little plates out of limestone as armor, like a knight in armor. Shellfish, the same, on top. The zooplankton, foraminifera. You see the holes in that net of calcium carbonate on the foraminifera? A coccolithophore fits right through there perfect. So they go grazing through the ocean in huge schools, blooms, grazing through blooms of coccolithophores and eat them. In the end though, and then there's the coral reefs of course on the bottom, which is about 50% of all the limestone has been produced by them over the millennia. They all go to the bottom when they die, or stay on the bottom like coral reefs do. And they take the carbon out of the sea and put it away 100 million billion tons. Even fossil fuels are only 500 to 10,000 billion tons of carbon in the fossil fuels. It's way less than the amount of carbon that's been lost to calcium carbonate through shellfish. And If this were to continue, if this were to have continued, and we had not come along to start restoring a balance to the global carbon cycle with our fossil fuel emissions and cement production, which is about 5% of our CO2, and that's actually taking the limestone and turning it into calcium oxide and CO2, putting the CO2 back from what the shellfish did. But most of it is putting the CO2 back from what the plants and plankton did by making their soft bodies, their actual living part, their tissue. So there you go. That is why we are actually the salvation of life rather than its destroyer. And this is what has to be learned. Because when people realize that we are not the only evil species on Earth, but in fact are the salvation of living creation, because CO2 would have continued to go down, and gradually the life on the surface would die, and gradually after that the life in those seas would die from where it came in the first place. Because the CO2 would all end up on the bottom as shells. That was going to happen. We changed that. Inadvertently. Just like the shellfish inadvertently, by making armor plating for themselves, presaged the death of all life. We have saved life from certain death as a result. Coral reefs around the world are dying. Reefs are not only invisible because they're underwater, but they're also mostly remote, especially from people around here. So nobody can really see what's happening. And of course, in April of 2016, during the El Nino event, which warmed the oceans on the other side of the world, and then we wept. There's a lot of weeping going on television these days in the newspapers. Then we wept. David Attenborough is getting really good at weeping. Scientists say 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is bleached, 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is practically dead, over 90% of the Great Barrier Reef is suffering from coral bleaching. That was in April of 2016. In April of 2017, the Great Barrier Reef is now terminal, as in cancer. Great Barrier Reef terminal stage, Great Barrier Reef in its final terminal stage, as if there's an initial terminal stage, and then a medium terminal stage, and then a final terminal stage. These headline writers. So that's what the story was. Well, what about in 2018, just last year? Great Barrier Reef definitely not dead. Great Barrier Reef showing signs of recovery. Coral reefs show remarkable ability to recover from near death. Well, the truth of the matter is, coral bleaching is not death. It is simply the expulsion of the plankton, which is what gives coral its color. It's a symbiont. There's a symbiotic relationship between a plankton and an animal. The animal is the polyp, which is related to a jellyfish and is clear. It has no color. So when coral bleaches, the animal is still in there, perfectly alive. But the coral is made of limestone, so it's white. The only reason corals have color is because of the phytoplankton and the chloroplasts make them either green or brown or yellow or red, just like leaves on a tree. And there you have it. But shouldn't scientists, especially reef scientists, know this? It's the reef scientists that sounded the alarm and then lobbied for $500 million to save the reef by studying it more. Right? What were they going to do? Go out there with reef doctors? And stop the bleaching? No, they were just going to go out there in a nice place and dive and snorkel around, and then come back and apply for another grant. Because even though the science is settled, we must study it more. The proof in the pudding here, they're saying the corals are dying because it's getting too hot. I showed you earlier that the world is colder now than it has been for 250 million years, and corals have survived all through that time, and even till today. The corals have basically retreated to the warmest oceans in the world. And the very warmest ocean of the world is the Coral Triangle, where my wife and I have been on 2 big snorkeling adventures on boats into Papua and down in the southern Indonesian archipelago. where there is by far the largest diversity of coral in the entire world, 600 plus species, and the highest biodiversity of reef fish in the world. So if you ever get a chance and you like snorkeling or want to learn, go to the Coral Triangle, Solomon Islands, Philippines, and eastern Indonesia. The warmest oceans in the world are the most biodiverse coral and reef fish oceans in the world. And the other oceans are cooler and therefore are not as ideal for coral as the warmest ocean in the world. Is that not a clue of some sort? Willie covered this a little bit. There is a sea of plastic twice the size of Texas in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They got two of them here, one on each side. The middle of the Pacific is very remote, and this is a fake image. All photoshopped up. Here's another one, a new continent, the plastic nation, they called it. You know, it's about half the size of South America, right? You'd think you'd know about it if it really was there. It looks like you can walk on it. But as Willie showed us, you can see Hawaii, and I don't think it's twice the size of Texas. And you can see the Fiji Islands and Noumea and New Zealand and all the islands off Papua New Guinea there, but you can't see no plastic garbage patch because it does not exist. And when you challenge people and they realize you know that it's a lie, they say, oh no, but really it's all microplastic. And it's below the surface, just below the surface. One guy tweeted to me that this is where all the see-through plastic ends up. All the clear plastic goes to the garbage patch and is suspended just below the surface. That's not how gravity works. When something starts to sink, it usually keeps going until it hits the bottom. Unless it's got gas in it, but that changes things. But if it's a solid piece of something and it's heavier than water, more dense than water, it's going to sink to the bottom. So they're making up stuff as they go along. And that's what I say about these people. They just make shit up. They do. Here's the plastic ocean. Willie showed a different picture of something like this. They have the nerve to blame this on plastic when it was actually caused by a tsunami that killed 16,000 human beings. That's the debris that washed off the land in the tsunami. What do you expect? Took out forests and farmlands and tractors and boats and every other thing. It's bound to take some plastic with it. But they lie about this. This is my favorite. This is one of the most remote islands in the world, they say, Henderson Island, part of the Pitcairn group where the mutiny on the Bounty people ended up. It's a really remote island south of Tahiti. You have to go by boat from Tahiti to get there because there's no airport on Pitcairn. And then Henderson Island is about 300 miles from Pitcairn. You have to take another boat to get there. And they say this is Henderson Island, way the hell and gone in the south of the Pacific, and that all this trash has accumulated there, like the polar vortex or something. You know, it's all been vortexed there. Except when you go on Google Earth and you look up Henderson Island and zoom in on the beaches, all you see is sand. I think they just made shit up. Look at that. There's not a, like, it definitely doesn't look like this there. You would notice that, even at this distance. But the worst thing they've done is David Attenborough, what he's done. You've heard about the walruses leaping to their death, committing suicide because there's not enough ice for them on the sea. It was a 30-pack of polar bears coming from behind, which is why they leapt to their death. Wouldn't you rather leap to your death than be mauled by 30 polar bears and eaten? You know, it'd be a quick way to go, landing on the rocks below. And there wasn't that many of them, actually. Well, there was a few hundred, but there was thousands of walruses on the beach. But walruses do not come on the beach because there isn't enough ice. In the summer, on the north shore of Russia, all across, the ice retreats away because it's quite far south there. Canada's islands go way further north. That's why Canada is the coldest country of the year, average minus 5.35 Celsius. Russia is minus 5.30 Celsius. Those are the two coldest countries in the world, and we're all worried about climate change. The Russians are smart enough not to. What did David Attenborough show on his nature flick? He showed an albatross feeding plastic to his chick, and he was practically weeping about what a sad thing it was that the mother albatross was mistaking plastic for food and feeding it to a chick. David Attenborough wrote the book, The Secret Life of Birds. He actually knows about birds, and he knows they don't have any teeth, and he knows that's why they have two stomachs. One, like ours, which has acid in it for soft stuff to go to, like a squid, and the other one for hard stuff to go to. That's the gizzard. That's why birds eat stones, in order to grind their food in their gizzard instead of with their teeth, because they don't have any. So albatross have learned to use pumice floating on the sea from underwater volcanoes, because there are no pebbles on the islands out there. It's just solid rock. And they find pumice because it floats, little bits of it, and they give it to their chicks to go in the gizzard. They take pieces of wood when pumice is scarce, especially, which it sometimes is because there wasn't an underwater volcano recently near them. So they give wood or hard nuts. And now, these days, there's these pieces of plastic floating around in the ocean. So they feed them full of it while they're chicks, because they don't have to fly, so they can have quite a weight of these grinding things, and the more grinding stuff they have, the faster they grow, and the faster the adult won't have to go get their food for them. So that would be an evolutionary advantage. So this is what's happening here. This is not infanticide, it is nurturing. And David Attenborough makes it out to be infanticide to all the children who are watching his nature films, when he knows perfectly well it's a lie. I'm sure he also knows this is a lie. Willie showed another one this morning that wasn't quite this graphic. This is staged. Obviously, you can't get that much plastic in an albatross chick. They got other things in there too, like hearts and livers and things. Not just a hollow thing. That's what they do. 1,200 marine species grow on marine debris, including plastic. Wood and plastic in particular create a huge amount of habitat and food. They are like a little floating reef. Crabs and bugs of different kinds, arthropods that is, like little shrimps and stuff, and barnacles in particular, this is the pelagic barnacle, grow on the bits of food, of plastic. That's why fish eat bits of plastic, usually. They don't have gizzards. They have normal stomachs. But they eat bits of plastic because the plastic's got food all over it. So they just swallow it. Evolution has been going on for a long time, and one of the smartest things it did in pretty well every species that survived through evolution was it made the out-hole bigger than the in-hole. Right? Because if the in-hole was bigger than the out-hole, that would be a problem if you ate something big that didn't digest properly. So that's what nature did. Even sponges knew to do that. So there you go. It's not going to happen that these animals get plugged up. And all these paper bags in the whales, I'm sure that's all fakery. Plastic bags in whales. And maybe the straw in the eye of the turtle was real, I don't know, but I wouldn't put it past them to shove the thing in there. No, I'm not kidding. They'll do anything. Look what they do. They do this. And then there's that whale that Willie showed, the plastic fake whale with all the plastic pouring out of its mouth. Those are just sensational images. How to solve this problem? Because plastic is really just litter. It's a lot of litter, especially in Asia, where they just throw it in the rivers. If you think of recycling, of all the materials we use, metals are simple. Almost all of them are recyclable. paper, much of it can be recycled, but not all of it. Wood, much of it can be recycled. Big timbers from old barns, whatever. You can recycle a lot of wood. Plastic, a lot of it can be recycled. But what do you do with old running shoes? What do you do with the thin plastic that's put on meats and stuff? You're not going to recycle that. It's covered in blood, and it's just like pizza boxes. They don't want it because it's full of pizza crust and tomato sauce. What you do is energy from waste. This is a highly sophisticated technology that is used all around the world, especially in concentrated countries like Europe and Japan, where it's too expensive to use land for landfills. So they don't have landfills. They have energy from waste. So what you do is you take everything that isn't worth recycling in the combustible category, because glass and metal are the non-combustible category, and even if you haven't got enough to do with your used glass, you just crush it and put it in road beds. Use it as an aggregate in asphalt or in concrete. So it's easy to get rid of the glass if it's not suitable for recycling. Metal's almost always suitable for recycling, whereas the combustibles are not. There's a whole portion of combustibles that get thrown in the garbage because they're not worth doing anything with. My garbage at home is pretty well all plastic now, and it's the packaging kind of plastic mostly. That should be going to make electricity. So there should be a price on it. It doesn't have to be that high. People will go down the highways and collect it for nothing. All these highways that you see that have people who are volunteering to collect all the stuff besides them, if they could just take it to a place that was going to pay for it, whether it's 2 cents a pound or what, it would go and make electricity and or district heating and or both. And that would solve that problem completely. I'll come to questions. I'm trying to work my way through this now because I don't do all 12. This is my favorite one though. Africa's oldest baobab trees are dying at an unprecedented rate, and climate change may be to blame. So see the baobab tree there? It looks kind of dead, doesn't it? Because baobab trees are one of the very few tropical trees that are deciduous. So they take a picture of it when it's got no leaves on it, as if it's dead. When they got leaves on them, they look quite alive. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of baobab trees in Africa. They're in Madagascar and India too, but this is about Africa. Now what if I put a headline, China's oldest people are dying? Apparently it's wrong for the oldest trees to die, however. If the headline said Africa's youngest trees are dying, you'd think maybe there was a problem. So, but at an unprecedented rate. Now it turns out the only authority quoted in this whole story anywhere in the world is a Romanian chemist. The Romanian chemist has declared that 8 of the 13 oldest baobab trees in Africa have died in the last decade. Wow. That is less than 1 per year. There are hundreds of thousands of them. There must be at least 100 or 500 dying every year, and they're probably the oldest ones. So that's what this was based on. And even Fox bought it. You know, it's just too good not to, because it's so exotic, I guess. I don't know what it is, but there you go. This is showing an actual dead baobab tree. They do actually die and fall over eventually. They can live to be 2,000 years old, just like the sequoias. Okay, this is a short one. Number 6. The reason warming has slowed during the past 20 years is because the heat is going into the oceans, where it will eventually come out and destroy the climate and the world. This is one of those impossible to prove things, because actually the oceans have 1,000 times as much heat in them as the atmosphere does. So it actually doesn't take much heat to change in the oceans to change the atmospheric temperature. But there's no way you can prove that the oceans have increased by 0.001 Celsius, which would amount to a 1-degree change in atmosphere. Something like that. I'm sure nobody actually knows. But it's impossible to prove. So this is the hidden heat hypothesis of why warming slowed after around 2000. And then, this is just too much facts. Then there is nuclear energy is too dangerous and radiation will kill you. Radiation, of course, is invisible. Not too many of us have a Geiger counter. I'm surprised. 2 people here have CO2 meters. That's cool. Paul and someone else had one. The fact of the matter is the only incident that killed civilians was Chernobyl. And it was a stupid design reactor that the Soviets built during the Cold War when they were behind the Iron Curtain and had no influence from the West. And they took their plutonium weapons production reactors and cookie-cuttered them all around the Soviet Union's power reactors. They had a positive void coefficient, which meant their configuration allowed an actual chain reaction to occur under certain conditions. While doing an experiment, a group of engineers from Nuclear Central in Moscow ordered the operator to shut off the safety systems, and 8 seconds is all it took for the explosion to occur after it went critical. No other class of nuclear reactor in the world can go critical. They can just get meltdown, core meltdown events like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, both of which were human error. And Chernobyl was just so stupid that that happened. It should not have, because the lessons had already been learned and the Japanese didn't do anything about it. But never mind that. It is the safest technology of all in terms of number of people dying per unit of electricity produced. No human being has died from civilian nuclear reactors in the United States since the beginning, and there's nearly 100, I think 99 of them still operating here, and yet nobody's building any. And it is absolutely certain that when fossil fuels eventually become scarce, which is now a lot further in the future than it used to be, that nuclear fuel will be there for thousands, probably tens of thousands of years. Because we will use all the uranium-238 and all the thorium eventually for nuclear power production. And the only reason it isn't happening in the United States is because there's lots of fossil fuels and because the idiots have convinced everybody that it's not safe. Whereas the smart people in China, India, and Russia don't buy that. They are going full bore with nuclear because they know it's the energy of the future for electricity production in particular. And I actually am in favor of conserving resources if you can find a substitute that would do just as good a job. And fossil fuels are one of those. We should be saving the liquid and gas fuels for what they do best. And we can make electricity with nuclear, so why not make it with nuclear? Not all of it, but more of it. And the same thing with shipping. Virtually all large ships could be nuclear powered. The whole Russian icebreaker fleet is nuclear powered, and 4 or 5 countries have nuclear navies, aircraft carriers and submarines. So if you can have all nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers, you can have all nuclear oil tankers and cargo ships with certified nuclear operators running them. And that would save a lot of oil. So there's tons of things we could do that would make sense. What do they do instead? They build windmills and solar panels, which is totally unsensible. I say they will rust in place. I think someone repeated that idea earlier today. I'm quite sure it's true. GMOs will harm us and damage the environment. Oh, I feel poor Monsanto, and now this glyphosate thing, but I can't understand why they aren't capable of defending themselves better in these situations and doing something more than they're doing. I just don't understand. I've been close to them for a long time, because in '96 I went to St. Louis to spend a whole day with their scientists trying to understand this new technology, just because I was interested in it. And then I ended up working for Bio in Washington, D.C. for a while at their big conferences and speaking on behalf of the new science. And recently I've spent years on the Golden Rice Campaign, which is a GMO, but I haven't got time to talk about that today, only to say here are some of the organizations that say GMO crops are safe or safer than conventionally bred crops because they are so much more tested for allergenicity in particular, which is about the only thing to be worried about. And it's just a fact that whatever's in them that is bad is invisible, right? Why can't people understand that? That they're being told that something invisible is a problem. And they're not told what it is. It's just GMO, like the ghost in the machine. Like as if there's a predator hiding behind a tree. You know, it's just completely ridiculous. But people are made afraid by invisible things, and all through history, this has been happening. You know, the gods are angry, right? They're invisible. You can't actually see a god being angry. But they say those things, and people are afraid because the ruler said it, or the Wizard of Oz. Leaked UN report says 1 million species are at risk of extinction. This is number 9. 1 million species are in danger of extinction soon. Of course, this is both invisible and remote because it's a prediction of the future, not a fact. The way they got this, well, first, here is actually the rate of extinction since 1870 of species. It's been going down. Why has it been going down? Because we started to care about it. It wasn't until the extinction of the passenger pigeon that the general public became sensitized to concern about extinction. Until then, maybe a few naturalists were noticing it happening and concerned about it or whatever, but there was no campaign about extinction until then. That's not long ago. But we are the only species that cares about other species going extinct. Isn't that good? Yes, it is good, because it's nice to have them here. Well, especially the nice ones. There you go. And here is a picture of the biodiversity of life on Earth since the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago, before which for 3 billion years all life was microscopic, unicellular, and confined to the sea. So this is when it really started to happen. And as you can see, biodiversity, this is the number of families, of taxonomic families, so it's family, genus, species, so it's a big group, like we are in the ape family. You know, and then there's all the other families, the cat family, and the dog family, and the weasel family, and all of them. And so there it goes up, and then the first extinction. Up again it goes a little higher, another extinction. Up again it goes, just as high as it was before. Down it goes in the Permian, the biggest extinction ever. And then up it shoots, higher than ever. And then the dinosaur extinction, down again, up again, to where it's higher than it has been in the history of life, just before now. Then the line turns down. This is the 6th great extinction. It's in National Geographic. It's in all over the web. Google 6th great extinction, you go for 1,000 pages of references to it, as if it's something that's really happening. I wrote to National Geographic, because it says down below in that little red box that amphibians, and I can't read it, says things are going extinct. Hardest hit, it says. Hardest hit so far. Beetles, amphibians, birds, and large mammals. I wrote to the National Geographic and I said, why does the line turn fuzzy where it starts going down? See that? The line turns fuzzy. Is it because you don't know of any entire families of birds, beetles, amphibians, or large mammals that have gone extinct? Because none have. Not even close. Not even a genus has gone extinct. Never mind a family. They wrote back and said, while scientists are quite certain that the 6th great extinction will occur, the timing is not for certain. In other words, it's in the future. This is the true story right here. There's where we are. There's the 6th great extinction there. There isn't one. It is a lie. And extinctions are being reduced. The main pulse of extinctions that occurred recently was when Europeans colonized the rest of the world especially the islands in the Pacific and New Zealand and Australia, and brought rats, cats, foxes, and snakes with them, along with various fungal diseases, which the species which had been isolated on those islands for millions of years were not familiar with and were wiped out by. That's the last time there was a pulse of extinctions, and it has been going down because those that were vulnerable are already extinct, and many of those that were still vulnerable are being protected by programs to keep them alive. So that's what's really going on. We are the good guys. Or the good people, that is. Guys is one of those man-centric things. Gotta stop that. Just gotta stop that. Here's some of the species that went extinct because of Europeans. The dodo birds, sailors killed them all for food on Mauritius. The passenger pigeons, people in North America killed them all for food into the markets. The Carolinian parakeet was a predator on crops, the only parrot in the New World, in the North American part. They were also in Cuba, but they're all gone now because they were preyed on farmers' crops. They had the unfortunate habit, as they came in huge flocks, as the farmers shot at them, they all wheeled around in the air above the ones that were falling on the ground dead until the last one was killed. Not a very good strategy. And that's what happened. And way back, when people first came to the New World, they killed all the mammoths because they were slow-moving and had a whack of meat on them. And that seemed to make sense at the time. So that's what happened there. Do you realize that camels and horses went the other way on the land bridge? They are New World species that went to Asia the opposite way that people and reindeer and wolves and grizzly bears came. They went the other way. The people in the other side of the world thought, wow, those things look like they might be useful. So of course, camels and horses became the main transport for people and goods. The Silk Road, Arabian horses, and all of that, the armies, the conquest of Rome by the Mongolians and everything was all on horses. And the people in the New World, who were the ones that had to leave for some reason and come across the land bridge to get over here on this side, what did they do with all the native horses and camels over here? They ate them all, instead of realizing they would be useful. Except for by the time they got to South America, they realized the llamas and alpacas were useful, and those are camels. But none of the native horses were saved. So talking about extinction and the loss of habitat, this is what happens when we produce ethanol for vehicles. Oil doesn't do this. This is what happens when you grow palm oil for diesel, biodiesel, for the European market. Normal diesel doesn't do this to the land. It just makes a little hole. And this is what happens with the solar panels. That was natural habitat. So this is stupid. Introduced species of predators and diseases is the main reason why species have gone extinct lately. Again, as I mentioned, from European immigration and or conquest, more like it. And this is really funny. I'm almost over. I don't know how long I've been up here, but it's probably too long. This is really funny. Why is only the good, cute animals going to die? Polar bears and penguins and monarch butterflies and sockeye salmon and narwhals and pandas and bumblebees, oh, the bumblebees, and koalas. Whereas there will be a plague of all the rats and poisonous things and jellyfish and locusts and fungus and spiders. There's going to be a plague of them because of climate change, for sure. Doesn't that kind of give it away? Yeah. Only the loathsome species will flourish. This fellow, John Robson, is a Canadian from Toronto. He writes in the National Post, national newspaper, and he's a fabulous guy. He's straight ahead, straight as an arrow. Okay, I'm not going to give you a big song and dance about the last 3 invisible poisons, but one of them is pesticide residues in our food, is said to cause cancer, birth defects, autism, and brain damage. Of course, these pesticide residues are invisible. None of these claims have ever been substantiated. The Cancer Research Institutes of the US and Canada published a peer-reviewed concluding joint study in '99, a multi-year study, that there is 0 evidence of cancer caused by pesticides and residues in food. but they pointed out that 30% of cancers are caused by tobacco consumption and 35% are caused by poor diet, and none can be attributed to pesticide residues in food. Number 11, farm salmon are full of poisons and they are destroying the wild salmon. This is invisible because they're underwater just like coral reefs. Farm salmon are not full of poisons. They take pressure off the wild fish by supplying the market with farmed fish. They provide one of the healthiest foods, and they employ coastal people year-round. And farm salmon costs a lot less than wild salmon because you don't have to chase it around burning diesel oil in the ocean. So it's a total lie. Over 50% of all seafood is farmed now. When I started my salmon farm in 1985, where I grew up in Winter Harbor, I ran it for 10 years with my brother and brother-in-law after I left Greenpeace, before I came back into environmental work again. We produced salmon there for 10 years, and it was really, really an amazing experience to learn. We were right at the beginning in North America of growing salmon, and now, at that time, only 5% of seafood was farmed in 1985, and now it's more than 50. And tilapia, of course, is one of the big successes. But try the steelhead that Costco sells, if you haven't. It is the best aquaculture product yet. It beats Atlantic salmon, in my estimation, for flavor and color and texture and just plain goodness. They have it everywhere, Mexico, Canada. It's being grown in the Columbia River near the Portland Airport. It's being grown in Lake Diefenbaker in Saskatchewan and Quebec, and I don't know where they get it in Mexico, but they probably import it from here somewhere. I haven't looked into all the places they're growing it. Whoop. Ocean acidification will kill all the coral reefs and shellfish in the world. Invisible. And this is actually the most totally fabricated thing there is. Some of the other things they've got, coral bleaching actually does happen, and actually the world is warming a little bit, and CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and so they got something to hang it on, you know, thin thread to hang it on. But here there's no thin thread involved. It is a complete and utter fabrication. Absolute rubbish. Ocean acidification. The pH of the oceans changes daily, yearly, hourly, more than they can possibly predict it will change from CO2 rising in the atmosphere. The pH of the oceans in coastal environments where rivers are coming in changes radically, not just the pH, but the salinity and the oxygen and the temperature and every other thing. You think that would kill all the barnacles? No. They know how to survive in really radical changing environments. All the shellfish that live near the beach all know how to do that. So just that one point puts the lie to it. Not only that, when CO2 was 6,000 ppm in the Cambrian explosion is when calcification began. When there was lots of calcium in the ocean. They're probably having trouble getting enough of it now. And CO2, because it's so low. So there you go. Those are 12. I bet there's 50. You could probably find 50 things, especially to do with CO2, like how many, the French wines are going down in quality, and salamanders are getting shorter, and like there's a whole bunch of really bad stuff happening from CO2. And it's probably all, they're not invisible, but no, who's going to check the salamander length? That's almost perverted. Especially if you get public money to do it. So ladies and gentlemen, that is the 12 fake, invisible catastrophes and threats of doom. The future is ours to create. It is a bright future. We have saved life from certain extinction by the calcifying marine organisms, which are not evil either. They are nice. They didn't mean to do it. But it's a good thing we came along to straighten things out. Thank you very much.